Hello, everyone. Welcome to everyone here in the room tonight in London and to our very numerous audience online. I'm Sara Pantriano, I'm the Chief Executive at ODI Global, and I'm really, really pleased to be moderating this conversation tonight. Before I get started, just one very important technical piece of information for those who are watching online. We have interpretation into Arabic and French. So if you'd rather follow the event in Arabic or French, you can choose, you can click on the interpretation icon and choose the language that is more comfortable for you. I'm afraid we can't offer these online unless you have headphones and you can, sort of use your phone to follow the event. This event comes at a time where I think impunity in this regard for human life and safety is incredibly pervasive and on the rise everywhere. I don't need to tell all of you that over the past year in Gaza and in Palestine, there's been a staggering increase in the violations of international humanitarian law and atrocity crimes with devastating human impact. Last August, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, said that 40,000 Palestinian lives had been lost in Gaza in the previous 10 months. That basically meant 130 people a day had been killed in Gaza over the previous 10 months. And as of last week, the 27th of November, the Palestinian Ministry of Health said that more than 45,000 Palestinians in Gaza had been killed in Israeli attacks, with thousands more buried under the rubble or threatened by illness and starvation. And these figures, of course, are difficult to be very carefully verified, accounted for. They're incomplete. They may actually understate the magnitude of the casualties. And beyond Palestine, we're seeing unaccountable mass atrocities and disregard for international humanitarian law becoming normalized in the DRC, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Ukraine, you name it. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that we live in an environment of total impunity. Everybody does what everybody wants, with many governments and actors feeling entitled to a get-out-of-jail-free card. And I think as the post-Second World War system of rule of law and institutions continues to be undermined, we have some critical questions as humanitarians that we're struggling to find an answer to. And I mean both international humanitarian officials and civil society that works in humanitarian crisis. What does it mean to uphold humanitarian principles when the nature and the conduct of conflict is shifting towards an ever-increasing disregard of civilian lives and a distinct lack of accountability for perpetrators? And how should and can humanitarians respond to such level of abuses? What are the limits of neutrality? What's next for the Geneva Convention? Here at ODI Global and with our humanitarian policy group have been really repeatedly calling for concerted political action to stop the atrocities being committed in Gaza and Palestine since October 2023. I'm really calling for the respect of international humanitarian law. But what we see is that the response to these atrocities continues to be insufficient and inconsistent. And we've also been stressing that the world is contending not just with a devastating civilian death toll, but actually with a battle of narratives. There are questions of how this violence is being framed, is being depicted, is being portrayed publicly, and of course with the double standards with Western democracies that are violating their own commitments to IHL and IHRL. A number of you have been here before at the beginning of December. Every year, at the beginning of December, the Humanitarian Policy Group convenes a flagship event. And we really aim, to address some of the greatest challenges and questions that face the humanitarian sector. And so there was no other discussion that we could have convened today. And I'm really, really delighted to be joined for that by some brilliant speakers and friends. Now, I know that a number of you would be looking around and thinking, where is Francesca Albanese? Because she very much has been, a powerful, formidable voice of legal and moral clarity on these issues, and we're really honored, to have her today. But unfortunately, she can't be here in person for family reasons, but we have her online. Francesca needs no introduction. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, on the rights of Palestinians. Francesca has been investigating Israelis' violations of the principles and basis of international law, international humanitarian law, and the Geneva Conventions. And, she reports her conclusions and recommendations to the Commission on Human Rights. But beyond this, Francesca is widely published on the legal situation in Israel and the state of Palestine. So today we will hear from Francesca what she has heard from the people in Gaza, and about the conclusions of the 2 UN reports that she has submitted this year regarding the commission of genocide by Israel. Joining me and during the conversation with Francesca, I'm also really, really thrilled that we have Ines Calamar. Ines she's the Secretary General of Amnesty International, but she's been such a prominent figure in the human rights world for decades. Civil society organizations with the UN, in academia. She's led human rights investigations in more than 30 countries, including on the excessive use of force, on torture, and on sexual violence. And of course, over the past 14 months, Amnesty International have published evidence of war crimes by Israel. They've been very active in rallying global leaders on pressing issues, including halting arms sales, the need for an enduring ceasefire, and on arrest warrants for war criminals. And Agnes has been very vocal also about the root causes of this crisis, the reality of apartheid and military occupation in Palestine. And last but not least, joining Francesca and Agnes, we have Nimer Sultani, Dr. Nimer Sultani. Nimer is a reader in public law at the School of Oriental and African Studies at SOAS. He's a human rights lawyer who's been practicing human rights law in Israel. He's a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and holds a Doctor of Juridical Science. He has published widely on these issues. He is the editor-in-chief of the Palestine Yearbook of International Law, but he also brings to this discussion personal experience as a Palestinian from within Israel. So I'm really, really grateful to you in particular, Nimer, for joining us to discuss something that is deeply personal and so close to home. And of course, this is a topic that is deeply personal to many, and one by which many are divided. But I really look forward, this evening to a constructive and productive conversation. I urge that everybody here today be treated with respect. I will be asking questions to Francesca, Ines, and actually to Francesca in particular, and then I'll get Ines and Nimer to react to what Francesca says. And then around 7 p.m. in London, we'll be opening the discussion, opening to questions, both in the room and online. So if you're online, do please submit your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible, although I recognize that the numbers are huge, both here and online, so we'll have to be selective. But without further ado, Francesca, many people here and online will be working closely on Gaza and the Middle East, but can you just begin by outlining the reality of what we are seeing at the moment, reflecting really on what you've been hearing from those that work with you but are on the ground in Gaza and the rest, and I was saying the West Bank too.
Yes, first of all, let me check. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Very well.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm really frustrated and disappointed not to be with you tonight. I would have loved to be part of this panel, and thank you particularly Sara Pontuliano for putting it together and for giving me the opportunity to be once again with distinguished colleague and really sources of inspiration in their own domain and on Palestine, both Agnes Calamar and Professor Nimer Sultani. So I would like to answer this question from 2 points of view. And I think that many in the audience, and thank you for being there, so numerous, many in the audience will probably will have an idea of the harrowing data that has been circulating for the past 14 months, and after which Gaza is destroyed. Gaza doesn't exist anymore as it was. There is a word, a term that has stuck with me from a report that I read recently, and who's reading I recommend to everyone. Cartography of a Genocide. It's a report, but you can at least have a look at the executive summary. It's a report put together with maps and reading how the morphology of Gaza has been changed by forensic architecture. So there are engineers and architects who have studied what has happened, and they have documented what has happened following every attack, every bomb, every assault on every inch of the Gaza Strip. So 365 kilometers who had been under a tight siege for 17 years, and 17 years which had already inflicted 5 major wars with 5,000 people killed, and including 1,200 children between 2008 and 2023. And in the past 14 months, there is a quantity of weaponry that amounts to 5 nuclear bombs used against that overpopulated land. 2.3 million people were living there. Now, almost all of them are displaced. And Israel has displaced them from north to south, evacuating them forcibly from north to south. The majority of them, over 1.5 million people, lives either in tents or in gutted buildings, because 80% of the homes are either destroyed or severely damaged, so they are not inhabitable. The civilian infrastructure, from power grids, electricity, power plants, the sewage, everything has been destroyed. As forensic architecture says, Gaza has been ungrounded. There are holes in the ground that make it look like a moon scenario, a moon landscape. And again, the civilian infrastructure has been leveled. I mean, there are no more universities. 11 universities have been destroyed, 350 schools. 36 of the 39 hospitals that were in Gaza are no longer functioning or not functioning as hospitals. There are no medicines, there is no equipment. And all these hospitals have been bombed, some destroyed, some made not functioning. This is why other experts have used terms like domicides, urbicides, so the destruction of all homes, of entire cities, scholasticide, the destruction of the education system. And on top of the ecocide, because of the environmental damage created to Gaza, Gaza is unfit for life. Gaza is destroyed. It's not a future and possible event. It's already. And what is the material cost? The human cost of this? We don't even know. We know that 45,000 people have been a certain death. They've been killed by sniper fire. So these are those who have been brought to hospitals and registered deaths. 17,000 of whom are children. This figures has not been updated because there is no capacity. And over 700 of them were not even crawling when they were killed. Many of them, hundreds of them, have been killed by sniper fire after they had suffered an explosion. So when they were lying on the ground, they've been shot at the head or the torso. This is the reality. I'm confronted with many saying, oh, but Israel says it doesn't do that. Well, I wish Israel let impartial investigators go help the Palestinians who are telling the story of the genocide from the ground. And so this is the humanitarian catastrophe in its really the most simplistic way of rendering it. But for me, as a lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, I see the catastrophe in terms of international law, because people, including in the UK, keep on talking of self-defense. It's an offense. This is an insult to international law. And I'm shocked that there are lawyers to say that, because this is the opposite of self-defense. There is an international court that claims that says that Israel is not self-defense. And even if self-defense is the right to use the force armed force that the state has, and it's attacked by another state. And Israel doesn't have it against the population it keeps under occupation, which doesn't mean that it has to cross its arms on October 7, no, but it couldn't wage a war, it couldn't destroy Gaza. So a genocide is never a form of self-defense. So this is Gaza today.
Thank you, Francesca. On this point of international humanitarian law, you have recently referenced the unprecedented use of humanitarian camouflage. You've called, you've used this expression to describe the appropriation of the basic rules of international humanitarian law by Israel in order to justify IHL abuses and atrocity crimes. Can you discuss what you think the implications of how, of this constant manipulation of IHL are on how wars are waged, not just in Israel, but also beyond, and this continued deterioration that we're seeing of IHL and IHRL?
Yes, absolutely. So let me, just to give some context and clarify what I mean by humanitarian camouflage, which is not even something new now in retrospect, meaning Israel had used this sort of strategy before, but it has been deployed in full force since October 7 last year. Israel has intentionally used and distorted concept of international humanitarian law to justify its systematic use of lethal violence against Palestinian civilians as a group, and to justify the extensive destruction of life-sustaining infrastructure in Gaza. So, for example, concepts as human shields, collateral damage, safe zones, evacuations, medical protection have been used on an everyday basis and amplified by particularly Western politicians and Western corporate media to portray what Israel was doing. But again, it was a camouflage, because meanwhile, Israel was distorting these categories. Like, you cannot use the category of human shield, which is a very specific category in international law, as a blanket argument to kill everyone who's vaguely in the area, because it's an urban area. So you cannot engage in the warfare that Israel has without incurring into the possibility of criminal conduct. Instead, Israel has said that Hamas was using human shields, but also everyone was Hamas. Everyone from the combatants, the active combatants, to the doctors, the nurses, the civilian officers, the local police, everyone deserved to die. And again, this language has been used in such a permissive manner, so as to gut those concepts, the principle of distinction between civilian and combatant, the principle of proportionality in military action, the principle of military necessity, or the principle of precaution when you launch an attack. So everything has been gutted of their normative content. In this way, because you were asking me what has been the consequence. On the one hand, Israel has created a world without civilians. There are no civilians in this way of thinking. And in fact, in March, I said, if this conduct is condoned, is left unpunished, this will become a new modus operandi in armed conflict. 6 months later, Israel unleashes this kind of violence against Lebanon, bombing entire buildings without without military necessity, because this is the thing. Israel has never had the necessity of proving anything or the proportionality. And so this has eroded the very foundation of the international humanitarian law system. And so this is, again, we are in a world without civilians right now.
Thanks, Francesca. Let's come to your report. You produced 2 UN reports since the violence was unleashed against Palestinians after the 7th of October. And of course, we all condemn what happened on the 7th of October, but that's beyond the point tonight. The first of these reports was published five months after the 7th of October, concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Israel had committed acts of genocide in Gaza. Your second report extends to violence in Palestine beyond Gaza, and it focused on the genocidal intent, and it was contextualized within what you call a century-long project of eliminatory settler colonialism in Palestine. Why is it important to you that the ongoing violence be investigated through the lens of genocide?
Yeah. First of all, I want to clarify that it has been extremely, extremely painful to come to that conclusion. And this is not the term genocide for me, as for any Europeans, and it has a very heavy meaning. And at the same time, we cannot remain stuck in our own perception and in our all mental biases. Because confronted with the deliberate human-made catastrophe that has been provoked in Gaza, I've noticed that the discussion regarding even the possibility that Israel has committed act of genocide has been treated as an untouchable one, a contested one. So it's not possible to have rational discussion because Israel cannot commit genocide. This is the posture of many in the West. But this, I want people to reflect on this, that this is emblematic of the impunity that Israel has endured until now, that has obscured, it has muted the sacrifice, the sacrifice that the Palestinians have endured on the altar of political convenience for decades. And so, yes, Palestinians have suffered war crimes like the construction of settlements, forced displacement, and so crimes against humanity for decades. This is not new, but we cannot miss the overall context today, because while Palestinians have suffered, have been, and again, of course, they've committed acts of violence against Israelis. Here, I'm not painting saints. I'm painting a population who has been oppressed and repressed by another group. And the overall context is the land, is for taking over the land. It's that bad. It's that anachronistic. This is settler colonialism 2.0. But however, why it's important to talk about genocide? Because if we get the wrong diagnosis, we will get to the wrong cure. When I presented my first report, there were acts of killings, members of the group. Of course, there was causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Deliberate infliction on the group of conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. These are 3 acts of genocide. And so, and I gave the figures, and here is not about numbers. The important thing in genocide is to have the intent, which is not just what is evoked. I will kill these people. The words are not sufficient. One, in order to assess if there is genocide based on jurisprudence and based on there is not just the Holocaust or in the Nuremberg trials jurisprudence, but which, by the way, we never concluded that there was genocide. The Genocide Convention came later to capture the destruction of the group as a whole, of a people as a whole. But still, we have jurisprudence from the Rwanda case, from Serbia, Bosnia, former Yugoslavia. And so the intent is that we have intent when there is determination to destroy. And it's not the killing of everyone. Genocide can happen without even one person killed or murdered. It's another kind of crime. It's different from war crimes and crimes against humanity because it's the intent to eliminate the people as a people. And here, I beg the Westerners among you to put aside the way you look at, our Western categories of property and ownership, because for an indigenous people, the land is not the place where they live, is who they are. And this, if we understand collectively this, we will understand why Palestinians have remained where they remained instead of moving to other places at the first challenge, at the first difficulty, because they knew that, Sarah asked me what people were telling me. So many things, so many painful things, like we are here waiting to die in order to make Palestine free, or we will not leave because this is the last piece of Palestine that remains to us. It's horrible. It's horrible because I would think, no, because they have been deprived as a collective, and for them, their identity is such. And Israel, and this is the last thing that I wanted to mention, Israel has wanted to eliminate the Palestinians from Palestine since the very beginning. They've been treated as an encumbrance, as a fifth column, as an enemy, as a security threat. And again, here I'm not saying anything against the Israelis per se, but their governments, and this is not Netanyahu's government, this for decades, this is what Israeli governments, subsequent Israeli governments have done to the Palestinians, to segregate them, to deprive them of their land, not only in the occupied territory, including in Israel itself. I mean, it suffices to be Palestinian to be treated. And this, Agnes can talk more about that, because Amnesty International has, as the Palestinians have said it for decades, said it's apartheid. It's apartheid from the river to the sea. And the moment, and this genocide is the escalation of that violence, eliminatory violence in order to take the land. So on 7th of October, pumped by the rage that they rightly felt, of course, the attack was severe, very ferocious. But instead of interrogating the causes of this, the Palestinians have been punished as a whole, and intent to destroy is visible and ostensible as rarely and fully documented, not only through the words of the leaders, but what the soldiers on the ground have done, because they have transformed themselves into willful executioners of that destroy the Amalek plan that Netanyahu and many others have made their own agenda over Gaza after after October 2023.
Thanks, Francesca. I'll come to Ines in a second. I just want to ask you one last question. We have a room full of senior humanitarian officials. One thing that strikes me from Gaza, but also from Myanmar, from Sudan, for so many other contexts, is that we, as senior humanitarians in general, really struggle to address long-standing political drivers of crisis. What advice, what recommendation would you give to humanitarians represented here and online?
And I mean, this is the question that will transform me into the most hated speaker among humanitarians. But look, let me be frank also, and I don't want to be, I mean, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but please bear with me, because 14 months of genocide ignored and denied, particularly in the West, have sort of affected my patience toward the West. And when we talk to humanitarians, it's generally the West. So I've said since the very beginning, when I became a special rapporteur, I've engaged with development NGOs and humanitarian NGOs. There have been the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Israeli NGOs had joined the Palestinians in denouncing the apartheid. So since the very beginning, I've been nagging, say, guys, you need to denounce this. You need to have this in your advocacy. And there was wall-to-wall consensus that was political. And for God's sake, humanitarians can never go into political, because they need to stay, they cannot take a side among the parties, but in a conflict. And this is why I say the framing is everything. And why we cannot get the framing wrong, because we get the wrong diagnosis, we get to the wrong cure. And you, as humanitarian, might become part of the problem. Because you see, by not addressing the root causes, the system has normalized the legality of the occupation. The system, even talking about the legality of the occupation was anathema before. And you see, the situation has mounted and mounted and mounted to the point of collapse, because it was not a conflict. It has never been a conflict. These are the categories that we Western people find convenient, but have nothing to do with the reality on the ground. And I cherish and treasure impartiality, while I've developed an allergy for this broad use of neutrality, which I respect when it's really about, someone liberating the hostages, someone delivering the food. But hey, how many of us do advocacy on top of on top of delivering humanitarian actions? Who are those who really have foot on the ground in Gaza right now? So the point is that if you stay equidistant from the parties in time of genocide, you are, in my view, no more, no less than Christian missionaries at the time of settler colonialism.
Well,
Sorry.
clearly people
I
that
told you, this is the
agree
way,
with
this is the
on
way to
on
become
the
hated by everyone.
question of, the apolitical humanitarianism. I can reassure you that at least at the Humanitarian Policy Group, we've been stressing for a long time that humanitarian action is inherently political. The minute you insert yourself in the middle of a context, particularly of a conflict, you are a political actor. You cannot avoid that reality, and you need, to reckon with that. And we've been discussing the continued utility of the principles and where the humanitarians should stand, particularly neutrality, for a long time. And there's a lot that HPG has written on it. So positions are not so different in some parts of the humanitarian sector, but not everyone agrees. And yes, let me come to you, to hear your reaction, but particularly on this last issue, because you've written a lot about the importance of solidarity, and what people, the general public, can do when they take a stand. So do you think there is something that humanitarian officials, perhaps also, development ones, can do to show solidarity? And are humanitarian principles a bit like, Francesca is hinting, to become part of the problem, to sort of get in the way of this solidarity?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to debate and speak with you all about the situation around the world. So maybe before jumping into solidarity, I wanted to re-emphasize a few points that have been made by Francesca, which I think are pretty crucial. The first one is that we are being plunged back into a future that we did not want. That is a future from the 1940s. We are confronting a pre-1948 system, or lack of. We are confronting a political situation where the architect of a system that had promised never again, those very architects are destroying the system that they had promised the world in 1948. We need to interrogate why. We need to interrogate why. And I don't think I've had the time or the space to ask that question enough. Why are those countries, this is the United States, it is Israel, but it's also Russia in Ukraine. Why? Why are we in 2024 in a situation where the entire system is crumbling down? The normative system, the institutional system, the Security Council, nothing appears to be surviving this roller coaster. I won't answer the question, but I think we absolutely need to put the question and to make it quite central, because if we want to respond to what's happening effectively, we need to understand what is the historical significance of what we are confronting. And Gaza may be the symbol of something that is ongoing and that we may have a great deal of difficulties to stop. But I think it's important to acknowledge that what's happening is historical. It is not topical. It is not just an incident. It is a product of different forces, historical, systemic, maybe more punctual. And there is a new era starting. There is absolutely a new era starting. Now, of course, everyone here and many of us want to hold on to what we've had, because what we've had has not been great. but has given to many people around the world a semblance of protection, normatively, legally, politically. And there is no plan B. I think that's the important point to notice, is that there is destruction of international law, there is destruction, or as Francesca pointed, the normative system is being gutted. The institutions are made to be completely powerless, but there is no alternative that is being put forward. There is not an alternative international law. There is no alternative norms per se, except the norms driven by greed and the power of the strongest. And that is quite, should send shivers to all of us. A mixture of greed and the power of the most powerful, driving that next iteration of the world. So I think it's to me, it's quite crucial that we, as historical being and as people with privilege, we acknowledge where we are at, historically speaking, and what are we going to do? So solidarity in that context, yes, of course, it has a role to play. And I will definitely not suggest otherwise. You know, I am in charge of an organization, after all, whose business model is international solidarity. But I think it's going to take much more than solidarity to respond to what's happening. It's going to demand that we, first of all, do an exercise in a great deal of creativity. And it's not because we want to hold on to what we had that everything we had was worth having. So we also need to reflect on what is it we want to bring forward in that new era that is coming up. And we don't want those rules to be simply and drafted by only those who have the power to do it at the moment. So I will call on all of us, on the young people, on academia, on everyone, to think about not just how are we going to protect what we had, because we still need to do so, but to also think of what kind of new world and new system do we want to do. It's about the present and the future. So we need to do an exercise. We really need to engage in creativity, in rethinking norms, in rethinking international law. How do we make international law much more powerful and effective in the world we are becoming, not in the world we have been? So I want to invite us not only to protect what we created in 1948, which we need to do right now, but to also prepare, because that won't be enough, because there are many powerful states that intend to get rid of it. And therefore, we need to be prepared to fight back, and not just in protecting what has never protected Palestinians. From 1948 onwards, that system never protected Palestinians. So I think it is quite historically fitted that right now the system is breaking down on the back again of Palestinians. Solidarity. Solidarity, of course, has a role to play. International solidarity has a role to play. I'm not as negative maybe as Francesca is, because I haven't had her experience of the last 14 months. I think there is a lot that can be done from the West. I think in order for solidarity from the West to play the role that it could play, we all need to do, we all need to be really self-critical and self-aware of why we want to support people on the other side of the world, or maybe living right next door to us. What is driving us? What are the conflicted emotions inside us? There is right now a very common terminology that we hear, and I'm sure you've heard it too, decolonization. Well, I believe in solidarity, and I believe it must be decolonized. And to do that, what do? We need to do an introspective exercise among ourselves, among each one of us, and with each organization. What is prompting us to offer solidarity? And is it being done for the right thing? Is it recognizing the autonomy of the others? And how are we doing it? So first exercise. Second, we need to find ways of promoting South-to-South solidarity and South-to-North solidarity. Now, what I think about Gaza, it's an interesting exercise in many ways. It's an, notwithstanding the horror that are happening, it is giving us a picture of what the world could be. Why? Because right now, those countries and people that are protecting the international system were not even at the table when that international system was drafted. They are the ones who have the most to lose because they don't have nuclear weapons, because they are not trying out new weapons with artificial intelligence and autonomous this and autonomous that. And they are putting out a form of solidarity, which I think is much deeper than what we could have, than what the one we had before. It's a solidarity from the South to us. It's a solidarity telling us, you guys are driving us to the abyss. We're already on the middle of the abyss, and we don't want to touch the bottom. Listen to us, because we're there for all of us. It's not just for us. We're there for all of us. So solidarity for me is a value that we need to uphold. It's a value that we need to cherish. It's what could bring us together, but to do so, there is a lot of stuff that need to be gotten rid of, and a bit of humility that must be brought in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ines. And I would like to hear from you as well if you have any specific advice for humanitarians, but hold on to that. You can bring that into some of the responses to the very numerous questions that are already coming through from the online audience. I'm sure there's loads in the room. Nima, let me come to you. Last week, of course, we saw a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah. After a lot of pressure, we don't know how long it's going to hold, but clearly there is, no similar deal in Gaza. What does that tell us about the dynamics in the region and beyond, do you think?
Thank you so much for having me. So I guess let me just comment very briefly on some of what we have heard from Francesca and Agnes. One question I think that Francesca raises the issue of naming. And I think if you look at it from the same perspective, we have been frustrated by humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, academics, Western media, mainstream media, of course, Western governments, of the fact of the lack of naming of the condition. Now, specifically when it comes to human rights organizations, we keep talking about naming and shaming. But that has not happened for decades in the case of Palestine. There was an avoidance of naming. There was a deflection. There was what the kids call these days gaslighting when it comes to actually talking about what is the situation that is creating systematic human rights violations. So for decades, we have been saying apartheid, and then you are dismissed, you are marginalized, you are excluded, and then when the major human rights organizations in the world say it's apartheid, it's completely quite ignored by Western governments and the mainstream media. And when they say apartheid, they don't say colonialism. And then October 2023 happens, and then immediately there's this kind of paradoxical movement in which there's a lot of articles in Western media, specifically in the US, that deny that Israel is a colonial movement. At the same time, the Israelis have been intensifying the trademark of colonial discourse, which is civilization versus barbarism, the children of light versus the children of darkness. So I think that's an issue we need to think about. Why has been this kind of avoidance of naming? The second issue, and that relates to the question of Western complicity on Palestine, and maybe we'll talk about this in a second. The second issue is this, of course, I agree with both Francesca and Agnes in terms of that there's some kind of destruction of post-World War II order, and that there was some kind of semblance of protection that was provided. But if you look at this kind of, there's a self-congratulating narrative of progress, that we as humanity have progressed and evolved into something better. Obviously, this is, a valid way to see things, but there's always a dark side to this progress. There's Walter Benjamin talked about every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism, because there's a dark side. And this is, if you look at it from the view of, from below, those who have suffered from this kind of, the cutting edge achievements of humanity, the post-World War II legal and political order. Of course, the view from below or the dark side exists also in, internally in Western society. So when you see the midst of wealth, in Chelsea and Kensington, Grenfell Tower happens. So that dark side is, and that view from below is something we need always to think about. So here the explanation can be neoliberalism. But also more generally, if you are a Palestinian, or currently if you are a Yemeni and suffering from air attacks by the Saudis with support from the UK, you don't see the international legal order. You're only reminded by a few deeds talking about the the Million dialogue between the Athenian Empire and the weak small island of Melos, that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That's what the Palestinians have endured. What the ICJ has recently called an ongoing, unlawful use of force. In other words, aggression, at least since 1967 in this narrative of the legal orthodoxy. So that was the experience of those from below. If we want to talk about decolonization, that's what we need to focus about, the experiences of those who have suffered from the system, who for some worked, but for many others who were weak, who suffered from a gross asymmetry of power, they did not see it in this way. And then in this narrative of progress, how can it be, as Francesca in her reports, but also in her initial remarks have observed, how can it be that there is an obliteration of Gaza, of a significant part of the Palestinian people, when we are all aware of what's happening every single day? When we see it, what Blenheim Negroli, the Irish lawyer for South Africa, said, live stream genocide in January in the ICJ oral hearing. How can it be that we are indifferent in mainstream Western circles, in the media, in academia, in corporations, in governments, are indifferent to this destruction? Within 1 week, we were told that Israel inflicted on Gaza more than the US inflicted bombs and explosive, more than the US inflicted on Afghanistan, a much bigger and less densely populated region, in a year. By the end of October, Save the Children said that the number of children killed in Gaza was more than the previous 3-4 years. Around the same time, Oxfam said that Israel is using starvation as a method of war. In December, also Human Rights Watch said that Israel is using starvation as a method of war against 2.3 million people. Within 24 hours in October, 1.9 million were told to leave their homes immediately. What now in June, the UN Commission of Inquiry said one of the fastest displacements in history. And yet there wasn't this kind of reaction from the, that a progress narrative of more humane international and legal and political system would have let us, assume. Why is it that there was an immediate sympathy with Israeli victims and none for Palestinian victims for months? Why is it there was an immediate sympathy to blue-eyed white Ukrainians against so-called Russian aggression, but then there is no similar sympathy to Palestinians, and there is no naming of the aggression when it comes to the Palestinians? Why is it when there is such a gross asymmetry of power, there is an occupier and occupied, a state imposing apartheid and a people subjected to apartheid for decades, a colonizer and a colonized. We still muddy the water. We are not able to be clear about the situation. In fact, we have all the leaders of the so-called West fly immediately after the leaders of Israel said, we are going to starve the population, and say that we are with you. Hospitals destroyed, and then the West is outraged when that happens with one hospital in Ukraine. None of that when it comes to the Palestinians. What is this sentiment? What is this politics of sympathy, of the politics of indifference that motivates it? Is it Orientalism? Is it Islamophobia? Is it anti-Arab racism? Is it anti-Palestinian racism? All of these are discourses we can talk about, and we can, if you want, we can go into the detail. But I think we need to have that in mind when we talk about the world is becoming, darker, so to speak, because for many of us who experience the dark side of international law and the international the political system, we have had our basic rights denied without much attention, support, or solidarity. And finally, as an introductory remark, what does that say about democracy in the West? Because many of us have been demonstrating in hundreds of thousands in London every 2 weeks. There was 800 academics or lawyers, as well as genocide studies scholar, who said and warned that this is a genocide. Francesca and her colleagues, the UN rapporteurs, as well warned against genocide. And yet, we did not see all of that sentiment reflected in formal decision-making in Western governments, like the UK. And there is no, in a democracy, in an electoral system, you would expect that there is some semblance of an expression of the will of the people or popular opinion, which was, for the most part, despite all of the propaganda, supportive of a ceasefire in Gaza, right? And then the media as well, for the most part, the mainstream media did not reflect the sentiment of the hundreds of thousands of people who showed up to demonstrations, etc. So that tells us that we need to talk about, are we at democracies? How is it that our political systems are isolated from public pressure? And secondly, how is the corporate control of the media is also preventing that kind of. Now, in terms of your question,
I'm not sure we can go to that because Francesca wants to come back in, and then I really need to open it up to the audience. I've got so many questions. If you can just get to it in 30 seconds, that would be great.
Okay, so look, the question of conflict and this view of the region as plagued with conflict. There is a master narrative here that I call Western innocence, right? And I want to invite you, before I unpack this a little bit, to the beginning of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. We saw there is at least 2 journalists who said, oh, poor Ukrainians, they're not used to conflict. Like Afghanistan, like Iraq. As if we, the Arabs or the Iraqis wanted conflict, right? We call the Americans and the British to come and occupy Iraq and destroy it and create the mayhem that we see now in the Middle East, right? As if there were no imperial interventions by, the Americans and the Russians in Afghanistan for decades. So this idea that conflict is something indigenous or internal is bullshit, excuse my French, right? Why? Because the West, quote unquote, is a major driver of conflict. The fact it supports Israel is a major reason for conflict. Israel is a major reason for conflict. Israel is still occupying the Golan Heights for decades. There is no urgency in the Western community. When Crimea was annexed, everyone said and agreed universally that this is an illegal annexation. Where is the same about the Golan Heights? What about the Sheba farms in Lebanon, also occupied by Israel? All of that is forgotten when Hezbollah tries to liberate, the Sheba farms. What about the decades of the denial of basic rights, freedom and equality to Palestinians, including Palestinians who are citizens in Israel? There is a lot of idealization of both Israel and the role of the West. as well as, internal legal system and political systems in the West. And we need to unpack that. Why is it that Israel can, for decades, say about itself that it's a democracy and a rule of law country when it's inflicting all these injustices on the Palestinians? And when now Amnesty said in its report like a couple of years, a year before October 2023, that since 1948, the totality of Israeli laws and practices are apartheid and institutionalized racial discrimination. So why is it pervasive to say, despite all evidence and logic, that Israel is a democracy and the rule of law? And now that Israel is fighting a democracy, a Western European democracy fighting the barbarians. So I think conflict is something not internal, and we need to talk about the role of the West in that conflict generation.
I think we need to turn this into a series of events, because we're not going to get to the bottom of a lot of these very important points that you are raising tonight, and your comments are really raise a lot of further questions, Nimer. But Francesca, I know you want to come back in, but can I actually start getting to
no worries. Let's open the debate, and then I will try to add on.
Reflect. But let me start with people in the room. Raise your hands when the mic comes to you. Please say who you are, if you have any affiliation, and try please to be brief so we can take as many questions as possible, both here, and I have a lot online. I'll start here at the front here. Always like to start with a woman, sorry.
Randa Ghazi from Save the Children. I'd like to ask Francesca about something that has personally shocked me, how the truth has become absolutely arbitrary throughout this year. And for example, you would hear the foreign secretary in the UK saying that there are no journalists in Gaza, or you'd hear France talking about the ICC immunity of Benjamin Netanyahu. So how does she explain this? Is it at all connected to potentially to the institutional Islamophobia that Dr. Nimer was mentioning? And the second question, very quickly, if you think that the whole debate around genocide has kind of like completely taken the attention, dominated basically the media landscape, which has been in a way counterproductive, because, whatever we want to call this, what matters is that it needs to be stopped right now.
Thank you, gentleman behind.
Thank you. Wasim, I'm a historian at UCL. So my question relates to the right of return under international human rights law. And when we talk about a just settlement, how does that actually play out then in practice? There's been a lot of parallels with South Africa. And there has been, to an extent, a sort of I don't know how to describe this, to see the South African system as a success, except that while the political apartheid was ended, economically speaking, Black people are still economically deprived. And so when it comes to resolving the conflict in Palestine, how will we resolve the land issue if the right of return is enshrined into international human rights law?
Thank you. Gentleman next. Then.
Hello, William Booth. I've got just a response to Agnes's kind of question about why is this all allowed to happen, and synthesizing the three of you speaking, it seems like a very important factor here is that Israel is the front line of conflict over whether settler colonialism can be allowed to stand, can be allowed to continue, and there are clearly many in the West who think that it must be able to. In terms of the question of international law, I mean, it's a horrible but simple question. Is international law dead? And if it is, what do those of us who care do about it?
Great. Suzanne here.
Thank you, Suzanne Jasper, SOAS. I'd just like to get the view from the different people on the panel, whether the recent indictment of Israeli leaders for starvation crimes is going to make any difference. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me take some of the online audience questions. Gosh, there's so many. Where do I start? Okay, there is actually a question that grabbed me earlier as I was scrolling through. How do you, this is from an anonymous colleague, how do you advise government and civil society around the world to overcome the chilling effect of being accused of anti-Semitism and the slightest criticism of Israel, which has concrete effects on access or cuts to funding from government and private funders? And then Lamis Hafiz from Muslim Aid says, these truths have been known to people from the global majority for a long time. How can we reform a system that continues to maintain the same power dynamics and the same interests? How will that power be forced to give up or change to truly reflect the system as we need it? And I'll take one final one. I can't get to all of them, I'm sorry. Let's see how quick they are at responding. I may do another round. In the face of all this hopelessness, what can we do? How can we challenge the system at the global level using IHL and challenging existing institutions that are failing and have failed? And how can we challenge impunity at our, AKA humanitarian level? Who wants to start?
Me.
Or just so that
Shall I
I
go? Shall I go, Sarah?
Yeah.
No, look, it's really energizing. First of all, to hear Agnes and Nimer, and you should have let me talk at the end because I started on the most depressing note. And in fact, let me go to the questions first, and then if there is time, I'll try not to take more than from 5 minutes. So yeah, the first question: the truth has become arbitrary? No, I think that the truth has becoming a revolutionary act. Like my compatriot Antonio Gramsci, and then the compatriot of many of you, George Orwell, used to say, look, we are facing, I mean, Palestine is a metaphor of, and sort of a global injustice. Israel is a settler colonial frontier, and it's very anachronistic in the way there is still a fight, struggle for the land. But look, this is what indigenous people have gone through and through for centuries. And again, so it's true that there is a colonial amnesia. We don't know. We in the West struggle to understand what's going on because we have not been interrogating our conduct. 500 years of colonialism and settler colonialism have shaped our consciousness of Western people. And let me go back to something that Agnesa said. I'm sorry I sounded so negative. It's true because I'm upset. As a Western person, I'm offended. I'm insulted by the way our politicians are really trashing 75 years and more of international law. But is it cause for despair? Not at all. This is the moment to act because we live in this, quite short period of time. It's how long are we going to live? On average, 70, 80 years. But this is not the time to measure the advancement. We wouldn't have had the end of slavery had it been for a human rights movement. We wouldn't have equal rights for women, and it been for a human rights movement, and so on and so forth. This is time for a revolution. We need to make that change. We need to activate that solidarity. But in order for it to happen, we need to have a sense of direction. And here, I would add to what Agnes was saying, yes, solidarity, but also legality. No, international law is not dead. It's alive, it's screaming, but it's from within a cage, and we need to liberate it. And justice starts at home, because the fact that our policymakers, that our leaders deny the reality on the ground, and I will come to David Lemmy. I mean, I'm sorry, because then every time I show up in the UK in presence or remotely, I end up saying horrible things about your foreign secretary, and I don't think it's the case. But however, it's the thing is that for these governments need to be made accountable. Who holds them accountable? Us. And we need to be very strategic in terms of litigations. Policymakers need to be brought to account. And you have great strategic litigation tradition in the UK. But also the other thing is telling the truth. Sorry, I didn't catch the name of the first person to say how do we get how do we get the truth less arbitrary? By speaking the truth more and more, by knowing, because knowledge is power, and keeping our voice as loud as possible. How do I react to the fact that it was said that there are no journalists in Gaza? He meant no foreign journalists, because it might confirm, unless he retracts and clarify. We should let him clarify, because he might have meant foreign journalists. But he forgot accidentally the 187 journalists who have been killed in Gaza and those who still remain, including in detention in Israeli dungeons. So the word, I don't think that the word genocide dominates the landscape. It's the denial of the term genocide that dominates the landscape. Is that people don't want to face what genocide is and use personal history and personal perceptions, their own view of what genocide is, while this is a textbook case of genocide. And it has been announced and has been there for decades. On the question of the right to return and the human rights law, I will be very brief. I think that we need to make the effort, all of us, humanitarian, human rights lawyers, criminal lawyers, to make the walls between our disciplines crumble. Protection is delivered when there is a holistic approach to protection. And therefore, to make protection happens when the rights of the person in need or the people in need are met. And the people in need will not look at, which body of law is it, IHL or human rights? They need to have their needs delivered, and we will be effective if we use all the instruments holistically. By the way, the right of return for the Palestinians is not even entrenched ingrained in human rights law. It stems from the law that was in force when the Palestinians were forcibly displaced, forcibly deprived of their property, and forcibly denationalized en masse. There were 3 bodies of law which allowed them to return, to be reintegrated as citizens in Israel, and to be restituted what they had been stolen. And this is why Resolution 194 of 1948 was written as it was written. The last point I wanted to make is, 2 things. I think that shall we make with the ICC indictment? Is it going to be a game changer? It's already a game changer, and it's exposing the hypocrisy of our liberal democracies. And I keep on saying, I have a Sicilian husband. When you ask him, how do you call the system that puts friendship above the law? And it doesn't look good. Don't let me even say that word, but it looks, eventually, mafia-style techniques being used, because threatening judges, members of their families, of their teams, in order not to exercise a jurisdictional function, not to deliver justice, is a mafia-style technique. And American Congress people have put this black on white. This should send shockwaves across the West. And still, you have some who are more comfortable with putting friendship above the law, but they will make the law crumble. And this is why it's upon us not to make it happen. Don't feel helpless, because you cannot do that. You do not have the luxury of feeling helpless, because the moment you have an inch of time in your life to waste, please devote it to make this world better. It's a huge sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice that we owe to a people which is losing everything. And this is what makes us solidarity means being together, solidum, one piece. And one piece meaning that when the other part suffers, we suffer as well. So we need to activate our solidarity. Last point, anti-Semitism. How to avoid anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is ugly, is revolting, is disgusting, as it's disgusting that it still exists after centuries of Jewish people being discriminated, persecuted, burned alive, and exterminated during Nazi fascism. However, today, while there might be a rise in that form of anti-Semitism and should be addressed in the strongest form, we also see that anti-Semitism is increasingly used to silence freedom of expression, to quash and to crush freedom of assembly, the exercise of fundamental rights, including the right to critique a state. Israel would be the same, would be criticized by people like me or Agnes or Nimer if it was head by Buddhists, Muslims, and Christians, because we don't care about the religion. It's about the compliance with international law. So be strong and defend yourself. Don't be afraid, because eventually when you bring these false claims and false accusations to court, you win.
Couldn't be clearer. Agnes.
Well, I think maybe we take new question, no?
Sure.
I think they have been all addressed very well. I don't know whether you want to add anything.
I just worry because we got 4 minutes to go. So if I open up to more questions,
that's too late.
be another
Okay.
half an hour.
We started a bit later, no?
Indictment of Netanyahu, I fully agree with what Francesca said. I think it's a very important moment, and it's one that I'm not sure governments will be able to run away from. They can say what they want about immunity, it won't hold in court. It was put forward in order apparently to get the ceasefire with Lebanon approved. That's what the French media reported. And I cannot imagine Netanyahu flying and coming to any European countries. I just think it's going to be, it's very unlikely that it can work, that he will take the risk. And if he does, great. Frankly, great, because it's going to give us so many opportunities to do everything we can do. So I think it's really an important turning point. The only place he will be able to go is the United States. I can't see him traveling to many other places. So I think it's an important moment, and one that we must nurture and remember that sometimes international institution can work, and whatever Macron and others can say, they won't have the last word on that one. They simply won't have the last word on that one. So I am personally, doesn't mean that he will end up in court in The Hague, but it certainly means that he is going to find the next decades very challenging. Please go ahead while I think through of any other things. Right of return, yes, absolutely. It's I'm not sure I fully understood your questions, but I think under international law, the rights of return is enshrined in the law, and there is absolutely no doubt that it must be upheld, and that those Palestinians who wish to return should have the right. Not should, they do have the right to return, and that has been recognized under international law. In terms of can we despair? No. What can we do? I completely agree with what Francesca said. We are very privileged, certainly us here. I think most of us, we can't afford to despair. We have to continue fighting. I think we need to be very resilient and learn how to strengthen resilience within our own communities and within our own organization. We need to ensure that the young people that are coming with lots of energy and ideas, that they understand that collective action is a far better option than individual action. We need to create institutions that have their back. We need to the extent that we can, protect them against a radicalization that will be so violent that we will not recover from it. Personally, I'm very worried about the level of anger that I witness everything I go, worried because I feel it in my bones, but I can control it, and I'm not that young, so I don't know what I will do at my age. But if you're 16 or 17 and that you witness what you're witnessing and that you see the utter disgusting behavior of those with power and that nothing works, you know, those that are now committing genocide are a tiny minority. It's Israel plus the United States. Yes, you're talking about the West, but I think broadly speaking, if you look at the UN General Assembly resolution, if you look at the latest Security Council resolution, I mean, those that are holding the keys to stopping the genocide can be counted on one hand. And yet, nothing can stop it. And to me, this realization of powerlessness, I think, is what's going to bring people to the edge and to a very radical movement from which it will be difficult to recover. So as an organization, as the head of an organization, I want to see how do I help particularly young people find actions that will make a difference, that may be revolutionary without putting them into under the ground, you know, a way of constructing the world without too much more destruction. And I think it's our responsibility, especially if your parents, grandparents, whatever, to channel that energy and that anger and to find a way for them to act on the awfulness of the world that they are confronting and will confront in the decades to go.
Thank you so much, Nima.
So in terms of, I guess we'll start with, in reference to what Francesca said earlier about humanitarianism might become part of the problem in some situations. I want to refer you to Oxfam's statement in June 2022 on the occasion of 15 years of the blockade and the siege on Gaza, in which they said, we feel that we became a cog in sustaining an open-air prison, because humanitarianism presumes that it's a temporary work, but in prolonged situations, it can become part of kind of relieving the occupier or the human rights abuser from their own obligations under international law. So that's why I think humanitarianism should be politicized rather than depoliticized by talking about the issues. And one of these issues is what Agnes just mentioned, so that there is a handful of countries. Usually when you read human rights reports, at the end of it, you see that there's a reference to international community, that the failure of the international community, actually it's not the international community because there's no homogeneous, coherent international community, but there's something called US imperialism. And that's the elephant in the room. And that's the major blockade to any kind of system of some fairness in the international relations. So we need to talk about that. We need to try to overcome that in any way we can in terms of how we conceive of ourselves as human rights workers or humanitarian aid agency. And you can see that, you know, the futility of depoliticization and the attack now currently on UNRWA. UNRWA is not like this kind of politicized organization, but because UNRWA is in charge of refugees, and refugees are 2/3 of the Palestinians, this is an attempt to undermine UNRWA that, as you remember, preceded October 2023. This started in the Trump first administration. Why? Because the Israelis are trying to liquidate the Palestine question. 2/3 of the Palestinians are refugees, and this is about the intergenerational identity of being a refugee passed from from parents to children. This is the crux of the issue. This is not about the involvement of a couple of people in October 7th. It's nonsense. And if you look at, speaking also of naming names, naming the condition, in the roadmap between Ariel Sharon and George Bush, Israel demanded recognition as a Jewish state. The reason why they asked for that, because they wanted, first of all, to deny the right of return, deny the ability of any kind of demographic change, because Zionism is based on demographic domination and ethno-national supremacy or Jewish supremacy, and the denial of equality to the Palestinians. And at the time, if that kind of change happens, they will have to impose apartheid much more kind of forcefully. And given the conditions now of so-called war, the solution they created is genocide, because that gets rid of the Palestinian sizable presence in the land, in the same way they did in 1948, because that creates a solution in which, on the basis of which you can claim that you are a democracy, because you eliminated Palestinian presence, and therefore you don't have to deal with it through electoral kind of bans. In terms of the chilling effect of anti-Semitism, well, the sad thing is to say the fact, which is the Zionists have, and their supporters in the West, have weaponized Zionism to the extent it's meaningless now. I don't think anyone anymore gets excited about this accusation, because everyone can see that it was weaponized to a laughable degree. And the hooligans in Amsterdam was kind of the recent example of that kind of ridiculous weaponization. But what's interesting is that how the two things. One, they are using anti-Semitism because they no longer have argument to support Zionism. So there is only bullying and exclusion from the public sphere. And secondly, there's a kind of revisionism now. We saw that again in Holland and maybe in Germany as well, in which anti-Semitism is seen as something imported or exported, by the immigrants who come to Germany or come to Holland and contaminate them with anti-Semitism. I'm sorry, anti-Semitism is homegrown phenomena, and the Germans and the Dutch should not overdo it. So, but it speaks to the alliance between the Islamophobic forces in the West and Zionism, and the only way is to defeat both. Zionism needs to be defeated. If we are talking about decolonization, there's a book by a famous kind of a British international lawyer about Chagos, and he represented Chagos in the ICJ. It's called The Last Colony. Palestine is the last colony. Palestine is still colonized. So all that kind of discourse that obscures the fact that Zionism is a settler colonial movement, and that is an ongoing situation of colonization that seeks to take the land, to deny return, and to transform the country from the Palestinian homeland to a different country. Finally, in terms, hopelessness and despair is the last thing we need now. We need all the energy and the hope and the support that we can give to each other in order to overcome the challenge. We need to be sober about what these challenges are. We need to call the spade a spade, as we discussed for the last hour and a half, and then try to cooperate different organizations, whether humanitarian aid or human rights groups, and to support Palestinian organizations. And not to be, again, the question of politicization. Once October happened, immediately many funders, European governments in particular, freezed the funding for Palestinian organizations. And before October, the Israelis obviously designated 6 organizations as so-called terrorist organizations. So there's a lot of this kind of politicization on the part of the Israelis. We need to reject that, and we need to politicize on the other side by recognizing these movements as anti-colonial, anti-apartheid, anti-occupation movements, and we need to support the Palestinian resistance against the ongoing aggression that, as the ICJ called it, or apartheid, as Amnesty called it, till freedom and liberation.
Thank you so much, Nima, Agnes, Francesca, for really inspiring us tonight. We could have carried on for another hour and beyond, but we do need to close, and I apologize, we are 10 minutes late, but obviously there was so much in the discussion, so much passion. I didn't get to all the questions, but we can always, carry on the conversation in the new year. I also want, before I share some concluding thoughts, to thank everyone in the team that enabled the conversation tonight, and particularly Dustin, Hannah, I don't know where she is, Kate, Alma, Jess. There's a lot of work behind the scenes to organize events like this. And thank you to all of you, both the very numerous online audience and you are in the room. I ask you to fill the feedback form. I've been reminded 15 times if I don't say that. So please do fill the feedback forms. They are on your chairs, because it helps all of us continue to improve the events we organize here. Just one comment in closing. Francesca quoted Gramsci, and as the conversation was going on, I was also thinking of Gramsci, particularly what he was writing on the eve of the Second World War. He's an Italian philosopher, I'm sure you all know him. And Gramsci was writing about the time of monsters, as he called it, when the old was dying and the new was struggling to come forward, and he called that period the interregnum. And I've been thinking many times lately that this is again a period of interregnum where the old is dying, but we're really struggling to see the new emerge. But what I take from the conversation tonight, it really is for all of us to shape the new, with creativity, to shape the new with the same passion, to shape a better new that builds on what good was in the past system or framework, but that really learns the lessons and creates a better new for everyone. And as Francesca said, this is the time to act. So I'll leave all of you with that. Leave tonight, but please act. It is the moment to act for justice for so many people, not just in Palestine, but beyond. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening here in London and wherever you are.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.